Everyone, welcome. I'm Michelle Parks. I'm from Cox Communications, and I'm the current president of C2HR. I really want to welcome you to today's webinar and invite you to join me for the virtual C2HR conference that's coming up on November 10th through 17th. And the event's going to feature 35 HR thought leaders, a dozen hard-hitting sessions, networking opportunities, and also continuing education credits. So I would hope you would all consider attending that. You can explore the lineup and get more information at c2hr.org. Today's webinar is provided free to our members thanks to the generous sponsorship of Eli, C2HR Champions, the Cable Center, Charter Communications, Comcast, NBCU, and Warner Media. Today's featured speakers are Stephen Paskoff, President and CEO of Eli, and Tucker Miller, Managing Vice President of Learning Solutions at Eli. We really appreciate them joining. We at Cox have had a very long-standing relationship and partnership with Eli, so I'm thrilled that they're here to present to you today. And we appreciate them sharing their insight on the important topic of inclusivity in the workplace. And now I'm going to turn it over to you.
Michelle, thank you. And thank you for giving us the opportunity to speak with your members this afternoon. My colleague, Tucker Miller, and I are going to be talking about our title, Acting Now for a More Inclusive Future. And let me put this in context. We're living now in a time which is highly charged. There are issues that we are all recognizing in our workplaces, in our world, we have to deal with that involve race and sex, religion, national origin, disability, ethnicity, age, sexual orientation, and also we're in a highly charged political world and time where people's strongly held views are membership in their own special groups. How do we take the talents that we bring into an organization, maximize them to obtain the best business results? That's what we'll talk about. And what we're going to talk about is acting. What do you do in terms of behavior now to define what inclusivity means? That's critical because inclusivity means different things in different organizations. And for it to be something more than an aspiration, we have to be able to identify it clearly, set up behaviors that make sense, and we do so in the context of results. Now is a time to act when the momentum and the awareness are high. And a more inclusive future means building an organization, as you hear me and Tucker say, that's linked to our values, recognizes the impact of having great talent in terms of maximizing their effectiveness to get great results. And that is what we want to discuss. Now, what we want to take a look at are behaviors, and the behaviors have got to be tied to the range of things on the preceding slides. And let me just mention that they range from a variety of issues, but what we're really talking about are behaviors and how they impact outcomes. What that means is that there are a variety of forms of behaviors that people concern themselves, particularly HR professionals. Quite often, they start focusing on the law, and when they do so, they often stop. But when you talk about inclusion, and I'll talk about this more in terms of what we view almost as an equation, you've got to look at other kinds of behaviors that A, conflict with your values, which are likely to include versions of respect, inclusion, diversity, fairness, justice, teamwork, collaboration, and also recognize that other behaviors that can be abusive and bullying, dismissive, unwelcoming, or rude and unprofessional can get in the way. There's a question when I speak about inclusion that's designed to focus on results. And your organizations are made up of professionals in a range of disciplines. They work in fast environments, as current as the email that I'll receive before the end of this broadcast from someone or the video I'll watch, or the commercial I'll see tonight, or just an hour from now? How do you work with them in a way that gets them to pull together? And again, I'll say it again, the idea is it's got to tie to results, organizational impact, and value. Now, I said that you've got to find out what the problems are. And to do that, pause for a minute and say that when we talk about finding out about issues, when we talk about finding out about problems that affect collaboration, collaboration seems to me, when it's best looked at through inclusion, to be a workplace where A, you engage the best talent wherever they're from, whatever they look like, whatever their background. That's who you want. You want them to deliver their best results individually and or as members of teams. And you also want to have the kind of workplace where everyone, no matter where they're from, no matter what their personal issues are, their background, that they will feel comfortable talking about ideas for innovation, ideas to improve your processes, and ultimately to raise concerns, whether it's about safety or electronic issues or new developments, but raise concerns about the way they're treated too. All of this requires a certain kind of listening. Before I explain it more carefully, let me just briefly tell you a story where I learned the importance of just listening. And the story basically is that 25 years ago, after most of a lifetime focused on civil rights, first as a government investigator and trial attorney, then as someone who advised and represented clients, I've had an interest in caring and priority in terms of civil rights. They seem to me as critical. But there was something that I realized that I was hearing about and I was reading about, and even though I'd done all the background work, it wasn't squaring with me. Why is it that people who didn't look like me were so concerned about law enforcement? What is it? Where I grew up, there were policemen in the neighborhood. It wasn't a major issue. And here's what happened. I decided I would talk to colleagues, coworkers, and friends, and then just ask them about their experiences with law enforcement. And what they told me is a range of experiences that were incredibly different than what I had learned and gotten out of my own childhood growing up. They told me about the kinds of situations, none thankfully as extreme as what we've seen with the horrific examples in Georgia, in Kentucky, and in Minnesota. And that they bring the names of Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd right to the fore. But they told me about stories that made it clear to them that they had to be careful. Their parents told them that. And I thought, that's so interesting. I'd never heard that. And then I thought about how I'd grown up. My mother, rest her soul, she was a sister and a wonderful role model, but she was extraordinarily, I have to say, worried and anxious about everything. Two examples. I was not allowed to play tackle football. My mother was concerned that I would get tackled and I'd break my back or a leg or do something to my brain. I couldn't play. Touch was okay, but I couldn't play tackle football. Hardball is what we call it, baseball. Softball we could play, hardball we couldn't, same reason. And when I grew up and started getting curious about the issue I've been talking about, I thought to myself, isn't this interesting? My mother worried about me playing baseball and tackle football, as we called it, but never about the things that other people I now knew and trusted and believed in was important and vital to them and to their children for their survival. What's going on? And what I realized by just listening to a lot of people, not challenging, but listening, and we'll explain the model in just a moment. What I learned was that I had grown up in a different environment, and my mother never thought to protect me because it wasn't an issue. And the only way I could really learn this in a way that meant something to me, and it seems to prove true in so many organizations, is to listening to people who come from different backgrounds. Now, let's take a look at what listening really means. It means in the workplace, we've got to listen for behaviors related to mission and vision and values, and you can read the list. And I want you to note that what comes in last is behavior that is linked to policy standards and concerns. I'm raising them last because it's so critical, not start and finish just looking at legal issues. A lot of what occurs in terms of daily interactions in the workplace, in meetings, in conversations, in business decisions, in normal workaday ways that we collaborate and interact, facial gestures, tone of voice, body language, eye rolls, those are things that are tangible and real, and you need to hear about them to recognize their impact, particularly if it hasn't happened to you. So you've got to listen for behaviors involving all of these. But then the next point is to realize how those behaviors at work are really, really significant. Listen for that too. Let me tell you two very brief stories. I had two experiences in my work here at Eli. One involved a nuclear power plant. And I talked to people who told me that they did not feel comfortable raising safety concerns about nuclear power where they worked. And I couldn't understand it. The organization had rules, it had policies, it had procedures, it had hotlines, it had all the legal verbiage, and we're talking about nuclear safety. That's serious. But I went into a room to interview a group of witnesses, and there was a woman who I remember, and I always will. She was across from me. I can't tell you anything other about her name or anything else about her background, because we asked the people to come in without their names or where they worked in the plant. We just wanted to hear what they said. And she said, I have a leader who doesn't listen to me. It may be because of who I am or how I look, but he doesn't listen. And I said, well, how does that affect you in terms of nuclear safety? And this is what she said. She said, if you don't feel comfortable talking to your leader on day-to-day stuff, I, at least, am not going to feel comfortable talking to him about things like safety, which is really serious. So I don't. And I learned that lesson that inclusion, how we bring people into normal interactions, is not just for workaday stuff, but it ultimately goes to critical issues like safety and quality. Here's another. In 2015, I was working with a group of surgeons, cardiac surgeons, some of the best technically in terms of their reputation and training in the world. And yet they had problems. The problems were that people often didn't want to work with two of these top surgeons. They had high turnover, and there were other issues too. I spoke to two nurses. They sat across from me with another colleague from my firm. Here's what they said. One said, I don't work for these two doctors. I come from a military family, and I would rather be a combat nurse in Iraq than work for them. I won't do it. That's because, she said, we are yelled at, we are screamed, insulted, people don't listen to us, and we don't look like them. We're not from the same background. They're men, we're women. It's a big issue. And what I realized is that person who had great skills was not working in that OR for two surgeons who could have benefited from their skills and expertise. The other person said, I work there. I do my job. I do the best I can. But not being included, being excluded, and she gave examples of behaviors about being yelled at or ignored when she had ideas, she said, caused me not to speak up, and it caused me also to feel every day drained and knowing that I hadn't been peaking my performance because I felt like I was reliving the worst day of my life over and over again. There were anesthesiologists. They came from different backgrounds in some ways than the two surgeons, both males like the other two surgeons involved. But they said that when they weren't listened to, when they weren't respected, when they weren't seen as peers, because they were, after all, anesthesiologists and not surgeons, which is in its own way a form of inclusion or non-inclusion, they said there's sometimes we don't speak up when we should, because we're concerned that what will occur will be disruptive, interfere with our focus, and we hope that the surgeon sees things, but we do speak up, although not as soon as we should. Now, those are inclusion issues, and they go to the heart of results, which are safety in nuclear power and safety and quality in surgery and healthcare. And when you don't have an inclusive workplace, which means how you act in lines of behavior like values, behavioral values like respect, civility, professionalism, you get behaviors that are suboptimal. So how is it that you just listen? You just listen by absorbing what you're hearing. If you want to find out what conditions are like from people who come from a range of backgrounds, ask them about what the work is like, but don't argue with them. It takes time to be a reflective listener. It's not exactly the same as when two people are talking about a common dispute or interchange that's just arisen. This is something that's more tied to normal, ongoing conditions in a workplace that become habits and standards, in essence, of culture. Now, we can identify behaviors. When you get people together and compile results, you'll see common trends that relate to what's going on in your workplace or work areas. That's what the key is to finding out how you fix it and defining the behavioral standards that need to be followed in line with your values. There is a problem, and the problem deals with clouds of what we'll call conceptual resistance. And the clouds involve those individuals who either know that they're doing something that they shouldn't, but choose not to follow the standards. Why? Because they always have, or because they generate great results and it's accepted, or because they don't want to be told how to behave, because they interpret it as being told how to think, when really this is all about behavior. You've got to be able to address that form of conceptual resistance, which is not to knowledge of standards, but a willingness to change behavior to align with them. The second issue arises, and that deals with those who know about problems. They're bystanders, they can be recipients, or others who are charged with the responsibility of acting. They've got to understand that when they don't act by speaking up, interceding, doing something to address the behavior, they're not following the responsibilities of members of a community. They're violating your own values, and by failing to act, they are not helping to obtain maximum performance. One thing we've learned is that individuals are generally, no matter how different they come from their backgrounds, passionate or often passionate with the mission of their department or the organization. That's why we focus it, and that's why results are so important, because it's something that people want to see happen, and they'll see this as an element of making that arise. Let me show you what we call the 5 C's of civil treatment, our word for this workplace that's built on engaging the best talent, getting the best individual and team performance, and finding out about ideas and problems. Here's a model that you can use to help look at your workplace and generate sustainable results. First, you have to have the commitment of leaders, your senior leaders and then all leaders, and ultimately employees need to understand that inclusive behaviors lead to results, are in line with your values, are important. Your top leaders need to model those behaviors. They need to talk about it. They need to share them with their team. Communication involves that kind of discussion. And that kind of conversation is not just once a year, it's in workaday meetings. Picture a team that any of you are in, where you talk about safety. You talk about it regularly, not once a year. It's part of what you deliver. Or let's talk about programming that you're constantly managing for excellence, or your clients or customers' response or satisfaction. Those aren't things you talk about once a year. You talk about them regularly. Since inclusion is tied into results, it's got to be discussed so that you discuss standards and also people feel able to raise issues to adjust them. And that also you want employees to have daily, not daily, but when needed, workaday conversations and an ability to discuss issues, figure them out, address them, and move on. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. Content's critical. That's training. That's one of the C's. We have 5 C's. There are 2 C's in your model, in your organization, but our 5 C's you're seeing right now. And the third is content, standards, rules, policies, and the like. Consequences are also vital. And consequences, as you see, can range from the way you recognize and honor people to correcting issues, even up to and including, as an example, and if necessary, separation. But if you don't impose a range of consequences, both as rewards and for correction, you are saying these standards don't matter. They're posted, but that's all they are. And finally, there's got to be continuity. As I mentioned earlier, let's say any of your organizations exceed, I hope all of your organizations exceed your sales goals. Will you start 2021 knowing we did such a great job, but there are no goals in 2021? Of course not. So the whole idea is to have standards that are continuously applied, put this all together, define what needs to change, use a variety of issues, including education that you'll hear about in a moment. And that's how you build what we call a civil treatment inclusive workplace. Now, I do want to say one thing about diversity and inclusion training. Right now, that is as of September 4th, there was an executive order announced and then issued on September 22nd, dealing with diversity and inclusion training and making it clear that there are certain types of training that violate this executive order, and that if it occurs, contractors, which I'm assuming many of you are, can be affected in terms of your contracts and other sanctions. We have taken a position about our training. If you want to take a look at how we view the standards, the citation is listed here, and we can make it available to you afterwards. But the whole idea is if you're talking about training, part of content and a solution, and you're dealing with diversity and inclusion, I do suggest, and so would Tucker, I believe, as you'll hear, recommend that this be done in line with the standards. And that means focusing on what brings people together, their common mission, results, and making sure that everyone is treated fairly, professionally, which is a core ingredient of inclusion. Now, last, for those of you with technical backgrounds who like math, or those who enjoy equations and want to share them with some members of your team, here's the way we look at it. The civil treatment inclusive workplace that I've talked to you about involves engaging the best talent, hiring people from all areas, all quarters you can find them, without focusing on race and sex and age, religion, the other members of the spectrum, elements in the spectrum I mentioned. Second, it's not enough just to find those people and hire them. That's really important. And if you do it in a way that's mindful, fair, monitored, and professional, you'll have a diverse workplace in terms of a range of different people. Inclusion, though, is means to get people who are engaged, who are given the opportunity to do their best work, to deliver the best results, and to do so in a way which meets the needs and exceeds those, ideally, of your objectives. Finally, you want them to bring you ideas and bring you concerns. That requires a cultural understanding that raising issues, raising ideas is welcomed and not frowned upon, or worse, subject to punishment. Put that together in terms of engaging talent, giving them the opportunity to do their best work, to speak up and contribute. And we believe with your staffs, your employees, your teams, that's how you get the best results. Now, I said I would talk about the issue, of content and training and learning. And I'm going to turn that over to my colleague, Tucker Miller, who will talk about how training and learning contributes to this workplace vision we've been discussing.
Thank you, Steve. And thank you for having this equation here because it is such a natural piece for people to look at that and say, yeah, I get that. I understand that. But really, how do you do it? This is exactly what we want. We want exactly these kinds of results. And we're bringing in increasingly more diverse people from all ways of describing diversity, diversity of thought, diversity of experience, diversity of tenure. There's a lot that we're doing to bring in that best talent, but how do we get those best results? And specifically, as you raised, Steve, how do we train people to do their best work and raise concerns and create the safety that's so critically necessary? Well, at Eli, we look at content from a specific lens, and this is through the lens of a lot of experience working with thousands and thousands of participants over many years. How do we take content that gets to best results, as we've described here, and engage people in a way that matters? So how do we make it matter? I'm going to give you a lens on that, but what we mean by it is we want to make the training relevant, not to Eli, not to this group of people on the webcast, but how do we make it matter to the people in your organization faced with the day-to-day challenges of taking diversity, of thought, of ideas, of points of view, all of those things. Those can be points of conflict unless we find ways to attune people and have them all looking at what are our shared common goals and outcomes that matter to us, to our workplace, to our culture. So we want to adapt all of the training experiences, content experiences, the communication to ways that are specifically going to matter in the context of your culture, your workplace, and people's day-to-day responsibilities. And we want to provide some ways to make it simple. This is not a complicated concept, but what are some simple guiding tools and thoughts? Steve introduced the idea of how do we just listen? What are some key things to think about that help us listen better? So we have some models that we'll use, and I'll share with you, to make the learning concept simple and readily remembered and applied in a regular and consistent way. And that consistency is also key in making the learning stick. When the learning experiences are relevant to our life here within our organization and my ability to lead effectively in my respective roles, and I have simple guidelines, I'm going to remember that and I'm going to use it over and over in a way that not only makes it stick, but where I start to engage at a level that demonstrates mastery of insight and application. As our world changes, I'll be a master of the learning and can change with our world and the nature of our responsibilities. So there it is. Make it matter, make it simple, make it stick. Conceptual. What would that look like? Let me give you an example, and I pulled a module to share with you that comes from our Civil Treatment Workplace program. And let's imagine that you are actually in the scene that you're about to see. You are walking by, and remember those days when we used to work in offices and we had shared spaces and when we didn't have masks on our faces? Let's imagine those days. Let's go back 7 or 8 months ago. And imagine that you're in your office, in your workplace, and you're walking by a group of people that work with you, maybe even work for you if you're in a manager role. You're walking by, and as you walk by, you happen to look over and you notice that they're going to lunch. And you overhear the following conversation.
Hey guys, wait up.
Hurry up, Jenny. We're starving.
Sorry, I got held up. If I have to hear one more story about Vivian's precious grandchildren, I'm gonna lose it.
So, what sounds good for lunch? Oh, how about the new Thai place?
Oh, yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah.
As long as Jenny's not driving. You know how they are.
Hey, I'm a good driver.
Yeah, well, that's what they all say. Oh, hey, you see this photo Mike just posted?
Oh, that chick needs to hit the treadmill.
Wait, doesn't she work here? Maybe they're dating.
I don't know. She's not his usual type. He could do better.
Very short hallway interaction. one that might mirror some interactions that you've experienced or been a part of or overheard at any other time in life. And in fact, we were having a conversation earlier before this webcast. Some of these conversations are actually showing up even on Teams or in a Zoom call. And I think it's critical to think that it's not exclusively in the setting. Let's adapt our learning and our insights to the world that we live in now. And that's part of what we're talking about when we talk about make it matter. Make it matter right now. Make it matter to how we're working, how we're interacting. Where is it that this kind of behavior is showing up? Now, let me pause for a moment. What kind of behavior was this? This is not the big red flag moment necessarily. In fact, at Eli, we have a term for this. This is that bump in the road conversation. And we don't know all of what the bumps necessarily were for these individuals, but imagine, as I suggested, that you are walking by overhearing, were there some bumps in the road for you? Something that caught your ear, caught your eye, might raise a concern. Now, in sharing this with many, many participants, I've heard a range of concerns, and I continue to hear more and more insights. And that's another piece around this strategy around Make It Matter. It means that we're really leveraging the ability to talk to each other and to take these situations apart and think about not only what we just saw on the screen, what was demonstrated in this video, but taking a moment and thinking about how else do things like this show up in our own organization? And importantly, remember that I suggested to you that you were walking by. And the question often that I raise with people is, what would you do, recognizing that you're hearing or noticing some bumps in the road, whether you're focusing in on the comment about her driving, or the comments about the person's weight and who's dating and what's happening, being posted online. And what about those two people in the background? Who are they? Are they other leaders in your organization who might be curious as to how you're handling this situation or not handling it? Are they applicants? Are they vendors? Are they contractors? Are they partners? Who are these people? And as we pause here and think about it, is it possible that there are any number of people who might see very narrow slices of interaction, just as we did here, who could draw wholesale conclusions, not only about these individuals, but about you as a leader walking by and about the organization as a whole? So now we have behaviors that may be very counter to the values that were posted on the website or in the lobby as people come in, but the actual day-to-day experience may be very different. Now, adding some complexity to this situation as we think about ways to make this relevant, we have everybody smiling and nobody registering any specific concern. And even though Jenny here said, wait, I'm a good driver, she responds in some way, she still laughs, she still hops in the elevator and presumably still goes to lunch. So did anything really bother her? And most importantly, does anything potentially bother you as you think about your values, your mission, the ability to collaborate, to be a more inclusive, open organization? Are there things there that you might need or want to address? And then most importantly, if you were a manager walking by, the question becomes, how do you address it? When do you address it? What do you say? And when I ask leaders, often as they look at it, they agree very quickly, there are some problems here. But when I ask the question, what do you say? How do you handle it? I will tell you that the most frequent response I get is silence. Now take a moment here. What might silence convey? It is important to listen, but there are also incredibly important times for us to speak up as allies, as leaders, as people who care. Might we need to address behaviors either as a consequence kind of situation, as we talked about, or is this a coaching? Is it a mentor? Is it a reminder? But failing to address it, to walk by in silence, may inadvertently convey to others who see you walking by that you're okay with it, you agree with it, or you're a participant in it. We don't know, we're not in people's minds, but I think it's important when we think about inclusion, it means stepping in and looking at things not only from our own point of view, and let's face it, we're all busy. There might be many good reasons why we're hustling and walking by, but we also need to look at behaviors through the lens of others and be prepared to address it in different ways. And so where do we start? Steve already gave us the answer. It's important to start with listening, and not just listening to the concerns, the complaints, the report outs, the exit surveys. All of that is really important, but listening to your own experience, listening to your own intuition, listening to what you notice, and being willing to do more than just listen. But are you willing to step in and be a part of the conversation? So we have this model around listening, but importantly, we have a model that helps people identify how to talk with each other. When would it be good to talk with each other? And specifically, what can I say? In fact, one of the most significant barriers that I encounter with individuals going through this experience is, I understand the equation. I understand I need to have a conversation, but please tell me, what should I say? What can I say? How do I talk about this stuff in a way where the stakes are high, when I might get it wrong, when I'm just uncertain? How can you help me be more confident? That's part of what we want to address when we talk about not only making it matter, but making it simple, giving people tools to not understand just the concept of the importance of having a conversation, but how to have the conversation, and then practicing it in a way that they become masters of it and champions and role models throughout your organization. And that's where it takes us back to that 5 C's model, that we've got daily content that is being demonstrated, committed to, communicated, that there's continuity throughout all of the interactions using this talking model, that we're talking and listening, both of them being equally important. So what might that look like? Let's imagine here that Jenny, who was bothered by that conversation, decides she is going to move into the conversation and check things out. She wants to check for understanding. She wants to understand what was happening, and she wants to listen to Cole. What you're going to see is that interaction, and as much as it's important what Jenny does in initiating the conversation, I want you to think about this model as also a representation here of how Cole does an effective job of listening. You will see very specifically that he's listening to understand and he's not defensive. Let's take a look at how that conversation goes.
Hey, Cole, got a minute?
Yeah, sure, Jenny. What's up?
Remember the other day when we were heading out to lunch?
Yeah, when we ate at that new Thai place?
Yeah. So, you made a comment that's been bugging me.
I did? Oh, what was it?
It was a comment about not wanting me to drive to lunch. I know I shrugged it off at the time, but it seemed like you were talking about something other than my driving.
It did?
You said something like, you know how they are, or that's what they all say. It felt like a dig about me being a woman or about me being Asian. I know some people find those stereotypes funny, but they're offensive to me.
No, I am sorry. I had no idea.
Yeah, I'm sure it didn't help that I laughed along. I just didn't want to make a big deal about it in front of people.
Jenny, I am so sorry. I promise I was not trying to hurt your feelings. That was just dumb of me. Have I said things like that before?
Maybe every now and then, but I'm not saying we can't joke around. We're friends. I get it. But that one just hit a little too close to home.
Yeah, I think I understand now. Listen, thank you for being honest with me. I promise that I will work on it.
Okay, great. I'm really glad we talked about this.
Yeah.
Hey, while I have you here, can I get your opinion about something for work?
Yeah, what's up?
Great.
So importantly, we see in that conversation not only a demonstration of how to have the conversation, and what I find so often in working with people, just the possibility that things could be better for having the conversation is itself powerful. But beyond that, we see demonstrated in that conversation a way to achieve some of those best results that Steve was talking about, that we're really focusing on how can we work effectively together to be more collaborative, to clear the air, to build trust and a greater sense of safety. How can we do that in an effective way and using that model effectively? Now, it is important to show people, to engage them in how to use the model, the simple model that we provide. But that stickiness and mastery really comes through experience and practice. And so moving from this demonstrated possibility of great results, best results, better results through conversation, we would then ask participants to practice, to constantly present to them opportunities to engage, to practice, and share observations. What worked well, what would I do differently? And so that's that content, the continuity of constantly emphasizing this is not a single moment where we're going to talk about a model or a conversation. We want some stickiness here in your experience to allow for you to have mastery so that we can all enjoy the benefits of more inclusive interactions with each other. So I know that I see the chats coming in. I know there's been some questions populating the chat, and we've heard some other questions coming up. So I want to invite Steve to come back on camera. There you are, Steve. Thank you. And before we dive into questions, I'm wondering if you have any other additional comments that you would offer to expand on what we just talked about.
Thank you, Tucker. Appreciate that very much. I think that one of the questions that we got, and I'm going to read it if I can because it really plays into what you said. Do you have any best practices for de-escalating a situation that may have a racial undertone in order to get to the point of effective listening? The best advice that I can say to that, and I think it plays into what you were just talking about, Tucker, is you've got to have, I think, sooner rather than later, a vision in place saying to people, look, when we deal with any of these inclusion issues, they're not easy. They're complicated at times, but they're important. And they can express themselves a variety of different ways. Now, the first thing is we want to avoid the most obvious forms of behavior that make it very difficult to resolve because they're such lasting, painful things that are said. The scars are deep and sometimes can't heal. That's at the very top of the triangle. But a lot of times there are issues that arise that may very well have a racial undertone, but how you talk about it and how you raise the issue, and with the idea that you're going to talk, feel free to express your views, the other person will listen, and then you can go back and forth, get an understanding, and move on. And that's why this is so critical, to have a system in place, a vision in place for the standards you want, and then also to get people to know when we do have issues, let's talk about them, let's try to work them out. That's the best way to resolve problems. Let me throw that back to you, Tucker.
You know, there's so many places that you can go with that, but I think, you know, I'm thinking about a couple of the other chats that we have here, and one of them is just that issue of courage. How do I create enough courage? It takes a lot of courage to move into the conversation. And there has to be a sufficient commitment that we're going to create safety. And there are certainly places where if the conversation isn't safe, you know, abort mission, let's walk away. But are you willing to hold open the possibility? This is a mindset challenge first and foremost, because so many people will walk away from a conversation just assuming it's only going to get worse, or because we had a bad experience with somebody, it's going to be a bad experience someplace else. But are we willing to test our own mindset and create the possibility that this could work out differently, could work out better? If it's not working out better, we don't want anyone to be put at greater harm or greater risk. But I think one of the things is you become a more inclusive organization and begin to talk about it at that commitment level, at that top down. It's important to acknowledge, and sometimes we're going to make some mistakes along the way because these are new behaviors for all of us. And we need to give each other some space, some room, some grace as we learn together. This is part of our commitment. As a learning organization, we're going to learn together, apologize when we make some mistakes, but lean in because the goal here is greater understanding and better results. And if we can really align with those common results that we're all moving towards, there's a lot more opportunity. And I saw that question, I'm addressing escalation and courage there. The earlier question that was posted had to do with, there's so much on everybody's minds. We're so distracted. How do we have this be an important part of the conversation? And I would say back off a little bit. This doesn't need to be central to the challenge. This is an asset to enhance every other part of the interactions and the strategies that you are engaging in. So if people understand that if we could leverage our inclusion and use inclusion to better our results, that it's the way to get to resolving these big challenges, I think that gives people a lot of momentum. They're not having to be perfect at inclusion. They want to use this as a skill and an asset to better address the challenges of the day. So long-winded answer, because I took 3 different chats there and merged them, but they were such good questions, I couldn't leave them alone. So I apologize for that. Any other questions?
I'm going to add something. Oh, go ahead. I know somebody else was going to say something, so I'll hold my comment for a minute. Did somebody else was chipping in? I think.
This is Parthivi. I got some other questions, so I just wanted to bring this one in. It kind of ties into what Tucker was just saying. There's so many issues around inclusion in terms of race, gender, ethnicity, religion, disability, the current political climate, sexual orientation. How do we bring everyone together when there are these different issues that we're looking at?
I think there are so many issues, and some that we can't even list because we haven't thought of them. You've mentioned the ones that I think are top of mind for so many historic and cultural reasons. To me, the whole issue goes back to what Tucker said. We have to be able to say, look, there's certain things we don't do, that we know we don't do, and we've known them for a long time in terms of what we do or what we say. Whatever your worst imagination or close is, you've hit it. But when there are other issues that range across a whole spectrum of content, we have to build a culture where people are willing to speak up, and speak up in a way that people will listen. And the people who are listening have got to be willing to say, I've got to think about it. And you work out a resolution and you move on. I don't believe you can ever teach all the different ways that one person can offend another for a range of reasons, nor can I think you can teach all the sociological, historical, and cultural reasons why behaviors are a problem. It's important. I really mean that. It's important for us to understand them. But in terms of focusing people's attention, I think it's very, very difficult to cover all the issues. But you've got to have standard rules about behavior, and then, as Tucker said, build an environment, which I think is the hardest thing to do, where people are willing to speak up, people are willing to listen, and ideally work things out sooner rather than later.
Agreed.
One of the other questions we got was, we work with a lot of good people, but I think they have no understanding about how race or gender affect our daily lives. How do we get people's attention to even start listening or thinking about the issues that we've been discussing today on this webinar?
Can I take that one? You know, one of the key things is to not address it necessarily, gender, race, but to really start to look at workplace scenarios and where are those bumps in the roads that show up for us. So if the central piece is we want to work effectively together, let's focus on scenarios and situations that are realistic and that align with what we're seeing day to day. And clearly that question suggests we are seeing things day to day. We're seeing things that other people aren't seeing, but what they are probably seeing is that we're not getting things done as smoothly, as quickly, as efficiently as we could, and start to look on the business objective as the driver and then ask the question, well, why not? I had a wonderful lesson learned. So our best lessons are often from our own client experiences that we're working with people on. And Steve shared a couple of stories. I had a client that decided to take a look at these issues, and they didn't really want to touch race and gender, but they decided that they needed to look very, very closely at, are there potentially some people within their organization that they were not favoring? And these are people that were very committed to their values, had an equal opportunity policy. They had all manner of things to really identify benefits for everyone in their organization. And they were excited about it, but they wanted to take a deeper dive. And I think this is that place of curiosity that you want to inspire. And they said, well, we're pretty sure that we're fair. We have a commitment to equality. We treat everyone really well here. But if we were to look at this issue, we might do a couple of these things. And they decided they would go ahead and do it. They would have a listening tour. They interviewed resource groups. They looked at exit surveys. They did some employee surveys. And one of the things that popped out to them just completely blew them away. They were really looking to prove how well everybody was treated. And what they found out, that there was one particular group in their employee population that was inadvertently disfavored. And what was surprising to them, it was one of the groups that they really liked a lot. They went out of their way to say, we like this group a lot. It also was a majority population within their group. And they thought, how could this group as a majority population be disfavored? But what they identified was that women in their company were not treated as favorably in ways that they never even recognized. There were issues around benefits and scheduling. There were a number of things that started to pop up. And what was fascinating is first that, but they decided, let's address this. So they worked very diligently to address the places of inadvertent disfavor and unconscious bias, quite frankly, where they were not favoring this population of people that they valued highly, but were having a negative impact in ways that they didn't previously understand. The comment that was so powerful, though, the client came back and said, you know, we found out that when we started to work diligently to favor one group, everybody in the company started to report that they were more included and felt more positively engaged. And that's really, I think, the opportunity to start with is, who are the people that we might be inadvertently looking? Can we inadvertently disfavoring? What are some things that we could do to find out a little bit about that, trusting that if we solve that little piece, we're going to have a lot of other people brought along and favored along with it. So the first line of response may not be that we need to address issues of race and gender. You may identify another place to tackle, but in making a few steps towards greater inclusion for one, it makes greater inclusion for all. And I've seen that play out time and time again, and I would just offer that as an idea. Steve, what would you say in response to that question? And you're on mute.
I'll add one idea too, is I do think, because the question was specifically about race and gender, I do think there are historic cultural issues tied to race and gender that are ones our nation is fighting a struggle with, what has been referred to bring out our better angels. And bringing out our better angels, I think, it can be very powerful when you talk to people who you work with and trust and or know, and ask them what do they think is different about their day-to-day lives that may be different about yours. Two quick examples. I talked to a few people recently after the events of the spring that I mentioned to you earlier. I said, what's it like? Someone that Tucker and I both know and have worked with a long time. Here's what she said to me. She said, well, I won't go into the department stores in Atlanta because I'm tired of being followed around. I said, what do you mean? And she said, I'm followed around and people constantly asking, are you lost? Do you know where you are? Is this really the right store? And she said, it happens all the time. This is a person who's an outstanding professional. And I talked to other people who I respect as much who told me similar things. One gentleman told me, a friend of mine said, well, when I go to stores, I have a hand problem. I said, what's your hand problem? He said, I don't know where to put my hands. So I put them in my pockets, behind my pockets, in front of me, in my jacket. Why? Because people think I'm shoplifting. These are two extraordinary people. And there is benefit as an alternative to listening and thinking about what's going on here. I wish people took the time to read more about our culture and our history and listen. I think it's vital, but it's also hard to get it done right. And I think you have multiple ways of dealing with the issue, and they're complementary. They're not contradictory, the ones that Tucker said and I said, depending on what your circumstances are.
So Steve, we have this last question. How do you get leadership to allocate time to focus on various ways to address this? I know you've been answering that question a lot lately. Can I hand that one over to you?
Glad to. Well, the whole rationale of approaching this issue in terms of results is for leaders to recognize this is a business issue. This is an organizational issue that deals with effectiveness and performance. Everybody in an organization, or almost the majority, care about results. They want the best. That should be something. Their responsibilities as citizens of the organization to have that happen. So when they say, I don't have time, because in essence they may, the point is this affects our results. Do you have time for that? Do you have time for sales? Do you have time for safety? Do you have time for government relations? Do you have time for technical issues? Because this is all part of it. That's why I think this is so critical to focus on, yes, values and results, because it brings people together and it's an organizational imperative that everyone can understand.
And the one thing I would add to that is that you can flip it and say, what is it costing you by not making the time to address these issues? Because that's the barrier piece. So there's the carrot and the stick, the positive, the negative, looking at it on both sides, because you're going to have some people who really respond to, yeah, I can make time because I make time for other things, but what is it costing you to not make time? And speaking of time, I think we're there.
We are, and I want to thank Steve and Tucker for their time today, for sharing all the information that Eli does on civil treatment. I want to thank all of you for attending today's C2HR webinar, and thank Eli for sponsoring this webinar and our champions for their sponsorship. And hope all of you join us at the C2HR conference at c2hrconference.org starting on November 10th. Thank you all, and we hope you all have a wonderful day.